Nobody should feel lost in a new city. Sit down. Coffee's on me, she said it before he could finish his sentence, before he'd even fully explained that his phone was dead and his hotel was somewhere in the direction of the rain, and he wasn't entirely certain which direction that was. She said it the way people say things when they mean them completely, without calculation, without the half-second pause that precedes considered generosity. Just immediately, warmly, as though the answer to a wet and exhausted stranger was something she'd already decided long ago. He stood in the doorway of the cafe for a moment, rain dripping from his jacket collar, a dead phone in his hand. The kind of tired that accumulates not from one long day but from many long days compressed into a life that never quite stops moving. And he looked at the woman behind the counter and felt something shift in him that he couldn't immediately name. Her name was Sloane Merritt, 29 years old. She had been on her feet since 5:45 that morning. She had 20 minutes left in her shift, a daughter to pick up from her mother's apartment 6 blocks over, and exactly the kind of life that made extraordinary gestures logistically complicated. She made the coffee anyway. She pulled a paper napkin from the dispenser and drew a small map on it. Not a rough one, a real one, with landmarks and a dotted line showing the route from the cafe to the hotel district, labeled in her clean, careful handwriting, with a small star where they were standing. She slid both across the counter. He looked at the napkin map. Then at the coffee, steam rising from it in the warm-lit interior of Clover Cup Cafe on a rainy Tuesday evening in Millbrook, Vermont. Then at her, his name was Stellan Voss, 33 years old, CEO of Passage, a luxury travel company operating across 34 countries, built over 8 years from a 2-person itinerary consulting service into an internationally recognized brand known for bespoke, deeply personal travel experiences. He had been to 61 countries. He spoke functional phrases in 9 languages. He could navigate the transit systems of Tokyo and Buenos Aires and Istanbul without assistance. He had gotten lost in Millbrook, Vermont, population 11,000, because his rental car's GPS had died in the rain and his phone had followed shortly after, and he had been too proud and too automatic to simply stop and ask someone earlier, because asking for help was a muscle that years of self-sufficiency had quietly atrophied. He sat at the counter and drank the coffee slowly, and for the first time in longer than he could accurately measure, he did not reach for a phone or a laptop or a plan. He just sat. The cafe was small. 8 tables, a counter with 4 stools, a chalkboard menu with the day's specials written in slightly uneven letters that suggested the person who wrote them was better at coffee than at calligraphy. The walls held local artwork, mostly landscapes, and in the corner near the window a small table held a collection of items that took Stellan a moment to identify. A child's sketchbook, a set of colored pencils in a worn tin, and 3 postcards propped against the wall, painted in the particular vivid, slightly too saturated style of a child who has not yet learned that colors are supposed to have limits. He looked at them more carefully. One appeared to be Paris, the Eiffel Tower rendered in confident purple, surrounded by yellow streets and blue cafes. One was clearly a beach with red and white umbrellas and aqua water, and what appeared to be a dolphin of considerable size. The third was a mountain scene, snow-capped peaks, a tiny red cable car, pine trees in exuberant green. Each one was labeled in careful child handwriting at the bottom. Paris, I think. The beach place. Snowy mountain with the car that flies. He was still looking at them when a small person materialized at the counter beside him, climbed onto the adjacent stool with the focused athleticism of a 4-year-old who has done this many times, and regarded him with the direct, undisguised assessment that belongs exclusively to children and certain varieties of very confident adults. "Those are mine," she said, nodding at the postcards. "I can tell," he said. "They're very good." "I've never been to any of them," she said. This was delivered not as complaint, but as straightforward fact, the way a child states a truth before they've learned to protect themselves from it. "But Mommy says maybe one day," he looked at her. She had her mother's eyes, That same quality of direct, unguarded attention. She was 4 years old and her name was Petra, and she was carrying a slightly battered sketchbook against her chest the way other children carry stuffed animals. "What do you call your sketchbook?" he asked. She looked at it, then at him. "My tiny world," she said simply. "Because all the places I want to see are in it." He sat with that for a moment. Outside, the rain moved against the windows in slow sheets, and inside the cafe, the lights were warm and low. And somewhere behind the counter, Sloan Merritt was closing down the espresso machine with the quick, habitual efficiency of someone who has done it 1,000 times and will do it 1,000 more. Stellan Voss had been to 61 countries. He had seen the Eiffel Tower at dusk and the cable cars above the Swiss Alps and beaches in a dozen nations. He had stood in all the places this child had painted from imagination alone. And in this moment, sitting beside her on a damp stool in a small Vermont cafe with a napkin map and a complimentary coffee, he felt something that he had not felt standing in any of those places, that he was exactly where he was supposed to be. Sloan appeared from around the counter, drying her hands on her apron. "Petra, don't bother the customers." "She's not bothering me," Stellan said quickly. "She was telling me about her artwork." Sloan looked at her daughter, then at him, with the slightly tired wariness of a single mother who has learned to read situations fast. "She'll talk about it indefinitely if you let her." "I have time," he said. She looked at him for a moment. At the honesty of that. The absence of the performative patience that adults sometimes deploy around children. She found him unexpectedly believable. "5 minutes, Petra," she said. "Then we get our coats." He found the hotel. He used the napkin map, which he carried in his jacket pocket rather than his bag, which was a decision he couldn't entirely explain. The route was exactly right. The landmark she'd marked, a green clock tower he'd assumed was decorative, turned out to be the clearest navigational anchor on the block. He stood outside the hotel for a moment, in the clearing rain, and thought about the cafe, about the coffee he hadn't been asked to pay for, about the map drawn on a napkin with a pen pulled from an apron pocket, about a child who had painted Paris without ever seeing it, and called her sketchbook her tiny world, and said, maybe one day, with the uncomplaining patience of a 4-year-old who trusts in futures she can't see. He went inside. He found the hotel's business center, charged his phone, opened his laptop, and sat at the desk for 2 hours. But he did not look at his email. He looked at something else, a set of questions he had been avoiding for several months, about why the company he'd built to help people experience the world had begun to feel, to him personally, like a mechanism that processed experiences rather than lived them. Why he moved through airports and hotels and famous destinations with the numb efficiency of a man checking items off a list. Why he could describe the view from a dozen mountain summits and feel, describing them, almost nothing. He wrote, at the bottom of a document he'd been avoiding, "She makes people feel at home. How long has it been since anywhere felt like that to me?" He did not have an answer, but it was at least an honest question. He stayed in Millbrook for 3 days. This was not the plan. He had a flight from Burlington to Boston, and then Boston to London, and the schedule had been constructed by his assistant with the usual interlocking precision. He rescheduled. He called it research, which was not entirely untrue. He came back to Clover Cup the next morning. And the morning after, he sat at the counter stool, the one near the window, the one with the view of Petra's corner, and he ordered coffee, and he observed. He observed the way Sloan moved. Through the cafe with the particular economy of motion of someone who has learned to do everything with half the time it should take. He observed how she remembered customers' orders without writing them down, how she remembered their names after one visit, how she asked follow-up questions about things people had mentioned the week before, a sister's surgery, a son's first week at school, a neighbor's difficult situation, and how the asking was not performative but genuinely interested, the kind of interest that makes people feel that their ordinary lives are worth reporting. He observed Petra's corner in the late afternoons. When Sloane's mother Nadine, a compact, white-haired woman who moved with the quiet authority of a former train attendant, which she had been, brought Petra in after daycare and settled her at the small table with her sketchbook and her colored pencils. He watched Petra paint. He watched her turn a blank page into a marketplace in Marrakech she had never seen, a harbor in Sydney she had only read about in a library book, a rice terrace in the Philippines she had found in a magazine at her grandmother's. Each painting went on the wall above the small table. There were 11 now. Sloane called it the dream map. On the third morning, Stellan arrived to find Sloane in a conversation with a regular, an older man named Clarence, who came in every day at 8 and ordered black coffee and read a physical newspaper, which Sloane set aside for him before he arrived. He watched her listen to Clarence describe a difficult week with the same quality of attention she gave everything. Complete, unhurried, genuinely present. When Clarence left, Stellan said, "You're very good at that?" "At what?" She refilled his coffee without being asked, at making people feel like what they're saying matters. She looked at him for a moment. "It does matter," she said simply. "That's not a technique. It just does." He nodded slowly. "I know. That's what makes it rare." What Sloane did not know, what she had no way of knowing, because Stellan had not carried a business card that evening and had given only his first name in 3 days of morning conversations, was what he did. She knew he traveled. She knew he worked in something related to hospitality. She knew he was from Portland originally and had been in Vermont for a conference and had gotten lost in the rain and had, for reasons she found slightly puzzling, come back to her cafe 2 mornings running. She didn't ask what he did for work. This was, she reflected later, probably because she was too tired to be curious about things that didn't directly affect the next 6 hours. And also because she had developed a policy, after years of cafe work, of meeting people where they were rather than where their title placed them. He was a man who drank his coffee slowly and paid attention. That was what he was in her cafe. What she was telling him, without knowing it, was exactly what his company had been built to provide and had quietly forgotten to practice: the art of genuine presence, of being somewhere fully, of letting a place and its people actually reach you. He left Millbrook on the 4th morning. He stopped at the cafe before his drive to Burlington, which made the timing tight but was not, he decided, a negotiable variable. Petra was there. Nadine had brought her early that day, and she was working on a new painting, a canal city, clearly Venice with gondolas in improbable colors and a sky so blue it almost vibrated off the paper. "Venice?" he asked, sitting beside her. She looked up. "The water city," she said. "Have you been?" "I have." She regarded him with the serious, evaluative attention she gave most things. "Is it like this?" He looked at the painting. The jubilant colors, the gondolas like bright parentheses on the water, the buildings leaning toward each other as though sharing secrets. "It's better than this," he said honestly. "But this is better than most photographs I've seen of it." She considered this. Then she turned back to the painting and added, with considerable conviction, a large orange seagull in the foreground. "For you," she said, "so you remember the water city." He looked at the painting. He looked at the child who had given him something from her tiny world without being asked. "Thank you, Petra," he said quietly. She nodded, satisfied, and returned to her pencils. Sloane came from the back with his coffee. She set it down, and he put an envelope on the counter beside it. "What's this?" she asked. "My card." "And a note," he paused. "I should have been up front earlier. I travel for work. More specifically, I run a travel company. I've been in Millbrook for what was supposed to be 2 days and became 4 because I didn't want to stop paying attention to something." He met her eyes. "I have an idea I want to discuss with you properly when you're not mid-shift. It's professional. It's legitimate. You can look the company up before you respond." A pause. "You don't owe me anything. You gave me free coffee and a napkin map, and I want to be honest about who I am before I ask you anything." She looked at the envelope. Then at him. "What kind of idea?" she asked carefully. "A project," he said. "Something I think you'd be genuinely good at and that I think would be genuinely good for you. And for Petra." He stood, picked up the coffee, and drank the last of it. Read the note. Look up the company. Think about it at whatever pace you need to. He put the cup down. He picked up Petra's painting. She had, unprompted, rolled it into a careful cylinder and placed a rubber band around it, which suggested she had anticipated this. And he said goodbye to Petra, who waved without looking up from her current canvas. He left the cafe. He drove to Burlington. He caught his flight. He had not been that honest with a stranger in a very long time. It felt unexpectedly like arriving somewhere. Sloane read the note that evening at her kitchen table. After Petra was asleep and her mother had gone home and the apartment was in the particular quiet of a life fully lived that has briefly paused. The note was one page, handwritten on hotel stationery, and it said, among other things, that he had built a company on the premise that travel was most meaningful when it was experienced through genuine human connection rather than curated distance, and that he had spent the last several years watching his company execute that premise for other people while he himself had forgotten how to practice it. He said he had watched her work for 4 mornings and had seen in her something his company needed to learn again, the quality of authentic, unreserved presence, of making every person feel that their story was worth hearing. He proposed a project, a documentary travel series for Passage's digital platform, not hosted by a professional presenter, not polished into promotional content but genuine. She would travel to cities across 4 continents, stay in locally owned accommodations, spend time in small cafes and neighborhood spaces, and capture the human stories that existed in ordinary places. The series would be called Ordinary Windows, a title he'd thought of on the drive to Burlington, looking at the lit windows of small houses along the highway and thinking about all the stories inside them that no one ever told. Petra could travel with her. That was not an afterthought. It was in the proposal formally, because he had watched a child paint the world from imagination and thought that the world deserved to be painted by someone who finally got to see it. He outlined the terms clearly. Fair compensation, full creative control, a 12-month initial commitment with option to continue, support for logistics and safety, and a production partner who understood that the point was humanity rather than aesthetics. At the bottom of the note he had written, "You gave me free coffee because nobody should feel lost in a new city. I'm proposing this because I think you understand something about connection that a lot of people in my industry have forgotten. That understanding is worth far more than a cup of coffee," though the coffee was excellent. Sloane read it twice. Then she sat at the table for a long time, not moving. Then she got up, went to Petra's room, and stood in the doorway looking at her daughter asleep with one arm around her sketchbook. The tiny world, pressed against her chest even in sleep. She stood there for a long time. She looked the company up the next morning. She asked a friend who worked in business consulting to review the terms. She called her mother, who listened to the whole proposal in silence and then said, with the calm certainty of a woman who had been a train attendant for 20 years and had seen every kind of person in motion, "Sloane, some doors don't come twice. Go through it." She called Stellan the following week. "I have questions," she said. "I expected that," he said. "Ask all of them." She did. It took 40 minutes. He answered everyone directly, without deflection, and when he didn't have an answer, he said so, and followed up by email within the hour. She found this more persuasive than any polished sales approach could have been. "All right," she said. "Let's talk about the first city." The first city was Lisbon. Sloane chose it, which had been specified in the agreement as her prerogative. She would choose the destinations, because the series was her perspective on the world, not a corporate itinerary. She had chosen Lisbon because Petra had painted it. In the painting, done from a library photograph and considerable imagination, the buildings were orange and yellow, and the harbor was wide, and a tram the color of a sunflower moved through streets that tilted upward toward the sky. Petra had labeled it, in her careful letters, the Tilting City. They landed in Lisbon on a Tuesday morning in October. Sloane with a camera she'd been learning to use for 3 months, and Petra with her sketchbook pressed against her chest. They stepped out of the airport into warm southern light, and Petra stopped walking and turned her face up toward the sky with her eyes closed, feeling the warmth on her skin, and then opened her eyes and looked at the city beginning to show itself in the distance and said, very quietly and with complete seriousness, "It's real." Sloane looked at her daughter. She thought about a cafe in Millbrook, Vermont. She thought about a man getting lost in the rain. She thought about a napkin map and a cup of coffee and the way kindness, offered without agenda, has a quality that lingers, that attaches itself to the lives it touches and moves forward with them into futures that couldn't have been predicted from the moment of the gesture. She crouched down beside Petra and put her arm around her. "It's real," she confirmed. Petra looked at the tilting city. Then she opened her sketchbook, found a new page, and began to draw. Ordinary Windows launched 8 months later. The first episode, shot over 10 days in Lisbon's Alfama district, centered on a 90-year-old woman named Dona Amelia, who ran a tiny cafe that had been in her family for 60 years, was watched by 11,000 people in its first week. By the third episode, the number was 40 times that. By the sixth, Sloane Merritt's name was appearing in travel publications she had read in the cafe during slow afternoons, dreaming sideways over the photographs. The series was not slick. It was not designed to make places look aspirational. It was shot at table height and eye level in natural light, with the ambient sound of real environments, traffic, children, rain, kitchen noise, the particular acoustic signature of each space. Sloane filmed the ordinary things: hands wrapping bread, a shopkeeper counting change, a grandmother teaching a grandchild to fold something, a man feeding pigeons at the same corner every morning, the way people maintain private rituals against a world that otherwise moves too fast. She interviewed everyone she filmed. Her questions were the same ones she'd asked in the cafe. Follow-up questions about things people mentioned. Genuine interest in the next detail, the quality of attention that made people feel that their ordinary lives were worth reporting. It translated completely to the screen. Viewers wrote, in the comments that Stellan's team monitored and occasionally shared with her, that watching the series felt like sitting with a friend who knew how to really listen. Petra's drawings appeared in each episode as brief, hand-animated sequences, her paintings of each city, shown first as she had imagined them, then dissolving into the filmed reality. The contrast was disarming. The jubilant, slightly impossible colors of a child's imagination meeting the textured, complicated, gorgeous reality of places she had now actually seen. People watched the dissolves and felt something they could not always articulate, something about hope, meeting the world and finding it against all odds sufficient. More than sufficient. Worth the years of waiting and drawing and believing in a maybe one day that had finally become today. 2 years into the project, Sloane opened the Cafe Gallery. It was in Millbrook. She had been clear about that from the beginning, when the idea had first been proposed by her mother, who had noted with characteristic practicality that Millbrook needed something like this, and that Sloane already knew the town, and the town already knew her. The space was on Clover Street, 4 blocks from the original cafe. It was warm and low-lit, with local artwork on the walls alongside prints from the Ordinary Windows series, and a proper cafe counter where good coffee was made with care, and a corner, always a corner, with a small table and colored pencils and a sketchbook for children who wanted to draw the places they might one day see. Sloane called it the open door. The name came from something Petra had said on the evening they'd returned from their final filming trip, a small fishing village in northern Japan where Petra had filled an entire sketchbook and gifted individual pages to children who'd watched her draw. "Mama," Petra had said, sitting on their hotel bed surrounded by memories and colored pencil shavings, "I thought the world was in my tiny world. But my tiny world was just the door." Sloane had looked at her daughter, 6 years old now, with the same direct eyes and the same unhurried seriousness, and a sketchbook worn at the corners from 2 years of constant use. And she had thought about a rainy Tuesday evening, a dead phone, a stranger who needed a map, and a cup of coffee she'd given without knowing what it would one day open. "Yeah," she said softly. It was just the door. On the opening night of the open door, Stellan Voss came. He had been invited by a card that Petra designed herself, a hand-painted postcard of a cafe with warm lights in the windows and a small figure at the counter and, in the sky above, an airplane trailing a dotted line across the clouds. He arrived at 6:30 and stood in the doorway for a moment before coming in, looking at the room, at the walls with their photographs and paintings, at the corner table where two children were already drawing with focused intensity, at the counter where Sloan was moving with the same quick, habitual economy he'd watched 8 years ago on a rainy Tuesday evening in a small cafe that no longer existed in quite the same form. She looked up and saw him. She picked up a coffee cup, already prepared, because she had remembered, from 2 years of occasional visits and one long-running professional collaboration, exactly how he took it, and walked around the counter and handed it to him. "Welcome," she said. He took the cup. He looked around the room again, at everything that had grown from a napkin map and a gesture of uncalculated kindness on a rainy evening. "You built this," he said quietly. "We built this," she said. "You opened a door. I walked through it." He shook his head slightly. "I gave you an opportunity." "That's different from what you did." He looked at her. "You gave me free coffee when you didn't have to. You drew a map when you could have pointed at the door. You made me feel like sitting still for a minute was a reasonable thing to do." He paused. "I had been traveling for 8 years and nobody had done that." Another pause. "That's where this started." "Not with me." "With you?" Sloan looked at the cup in his hands, then at the room around them, then at Petra, who was across the cafe explaining, her current drawing to one of the children at the corner table with the confident authority of a 6-year-old, who has been to 17 countries and has opinions. "Nobody should feel lost in a new city," she said softly, echoing the thing she'd said on the first night without knowing what it would eventually mean. Stellan smiled. "The real kind. The kind that changes the whole face." "No," he agreed. "They shouldn't. Some journeys begin with a boarding pass and a destination. Some begin with a cup of coffee on a rainy evening and the simple, radical decision to treat a stranger like someone who matters." Sloan Merritt had not been trying to change her life that Tuesday. She was tired. She was at the end of her shift, and she had a daughter to collect and a bus to catch. She had given free coffee because it was the right thing, and she had drawn a map because she could. That was all. And that was everything. The world is full of doors that look like ordinary moments. Kindness is the hand that opens them. If this story touched your heart, please like, share, subscribe, and comment. Let's spread more stories of kindness and hope together.